Hello, I'm Peter Marsh, and it's time for another Aether and ATX video. I haven't posted one of these in a while, so I'm excited to get another one out. Today, I'm going to be doing two things. I'm going to be talking about a metaphor for life experience, and then I'm also going to be talking about the idea of multiple realities and what that might actually look like for skeptical people like you and me. So let's do that metaphor real quick. I've answered this before on this channel, but I've talked about where the Aether and ATX name comes from. For the longest time in my life, I had the nickname of Anchor, and I used that for this channel. Originally, it was called the Anchor Pete channel. All of my screen names and things would be Anchor Pete something, right? And it's funny, just real quick, I got this name from a comic book store owner who named all of his comic book customers something Jones, right? The store was called Comic Book Jones, and so everyone would have different names like Socko Jones or like Pancake Jones, and he called me Anchor Jones. I don't know where that comes from, and he never explained it to me, but I just liked the sound of anchor, so that was my nickname. And when I started to go through manifestation and like journaling, like when I was like researching manifestation and I was trying some of the techniques, I would just write out my experiences over and over again, and I would just fill page after page of notes on manifestation. So I noticed that I would kind of reach these different points. One point that I had been in throughout my whole life was this point where I would kind of spiral and think really negative thoughts about myself, think that things were hopeless, and I decided to give that state the name of anchor. I mean, how appropriate is that? You're being pulled down, right? Then I said, okay, well, what's the inverse of that? When I'm feeling really good, when I'm feeling really energetic, motivated, really positive about myself, what's the opposite of anchor? Something, instead of something pulling you down, what is something that's like floating and in the air? And I came up with the word aether. So that's where Aether and ATX comes from. So I usually refer to these two states, at least for myself, and this helps me kind of think about where I'm at and kind of visualize what's going on with me. I usually think of it as the anchor state and the aether state. Now, this works just for me. You can think about the experiences that you go through, how you feel, and you might notice that you're in different states at different points too. And you might come up with your own names, and they might not be as literal as an anchor or aether, right? But as I was journaling yesterday, I thought of the different modes that I go through in a cycle of my life. And I was able to go back to January of 2025 and chronicle my life from then till now, which is October 24th. And I just started to notice like these kind of ups and downs, right? The metaphor I came up with, and I thought this would actually make a really good short film, would be imagine a person, you can imagine yourself, and imagine that you are in a body of water. And the person's in a body of water. Now, that body of water could be a swimming pool in a indoor swimming pool area. It could be in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't matter what the body of water is. The water is the important part for the metaphor. So imagine you start out and you're just floating on the surface of that water. You've learned how to float as a kid, and you are just floating there. The water underneath you directly is clear, but the deeper you look, the darker it gets. So you're floating there on the surface. Like I said, you learned how to float from a young age. And then all of a sudden you get pulled down. You get pulled down, down, deep into the water to where you are in that dark part of the water. And you can't see around you, and you are drowning and you're freaking out, right? So you swim and you swim and you swim, and you fight against the fear, you fight against the water that's pushing down on you. You break the surface, and after you calm down for a little bit, after there's a little bit of peace and relaxation, you're able to float on that surface once again. Last part. You start to float on that surface, you get really comfortable, you feel really safe, your mind starts to wander. And you're laying there, you're floating, your head is above the water, and all of a sudden, you start to notice that you are floating above the water. You rise up and you rise up, and you are above the water completely to where none of you is touching the water. You float up higher and higher, and you just feel great. You feel magical, right? You get real high, but then your mind starts to wander, thoughts start to creep through your head, and you start to descend back towards the water, right? And then you're resting on top of the water. You're like, oh, I'm on the water again. I might get pulled down. And then you do, and you get pulled underwater. And the cycle repeats itself, always going down into the darkness, rising back up, floating on the surface, and eventually floating above the surface. So what the hell does any of this have to do with the rest of the videos that I've made for this channel? I thought that this was a good metaphor for the different states that I've gone through when I have used manifestation techniques. And I directly associated those two states that I mentioned before, the anchor state and the aether state, with two parts of that metaphor. Obviously, the anchor state would be when you're being pulled into the darkness. You're being pulled under the water, right? An anchor literally holds a boat in place. Like, it goes into the water, it goes down, right? And then you struggle. You eventually get this kind of equilibrium point. You float. And then once you feel confident and you feel good about your floating, then you rise up. And that's what I would call the aether state. Now, for me in my life, I have mostly been in that anchor state. I've mostly felt like I was drowning for most of my life, and I'm 43 years old. I've kind of felt like I've been like struggling to catch a breath. And then the more I would research manifestation, the more I'd ask myself some really detailed, deep questions about myself and my life history, the more I started to change my way of thinking. And I started to realize I was just kind of floating. And then eventually I did have that feeling of I am like floating above the water. I'm above this. What does the water mean? I feel like the water is reality. It's our 3D tangible world. It's the life that we live in, that we could go on autopilot experiencing it. We don't have to like think about it. It's just the world that we automatically manifest based on our beliefs. We've like programmed these beliefs. We've set up this world, and now we're just floating on the surface. And then when you want to change things, when you want to change your reality, you have to reach that higher point where you're floating above the water. I think, I've gone through all those stages. I've gone through all those stages in like the past 2 months, right? And I know a lot of people who are usually in one of those 3 stages. I don't know a lot of people that are in that floating on the top aether stage. A lot of times they are people that I see on YouTube or people whose stuff I've read. But a lot of people are either in that kind of floating on the surface of the water part, or they are in that drowning part. And one thing I want to say about this is that when you're in that drowning phase, when you're in the darkness and you're struggling to get to the surface, you just want to get a breath, it's real easy to find people to commiserate that are in that phase. You know, misery loves company. And I know a lot of people, that's like their go-to thing, is to talk about how rough life is, how bad things have been, all these bad things that have happened to them, how bad their life is at the moment. And I always feel for those people. I absolutely have been one of those people. And I still am sometimes. I still do like to vent to like the people closest to me about challenges in my life. But one thing that I've learned through researching manifestation is the more you focus on something, the stronger you make it. And if you think of your reality in these negative terms, you're just solidifying that in your life. So I try not to talk about the kind of things that would make me feel like I was drowning. I try to focus on the positive for the most part. And if I find myself going in a negative direction with my conversation, I kind of pause for a minute and I just become aware of what I'm saying. I've noticed that has made a major change in the way I view the world, and then also my interactions with people. I think that, like, when I would talk about my problems and stuff like that, I would read people's faces. Remember that video I did on like body language and stuff? Read their body language. And I think people felt sympathy for me, but I think also it felt like I was kind of draining their energy. And I find that when I'm talking about something, like I'm talking about taking an action or talking about things being positive, I don't have that sense of, oh, I'm asking a lot from this person. It seems more like they're engaged and they want to talk about this stuff. So just in general, I strongly encourage like limiting your discussion of all the negative things in your life to a select few people. And even in those situations, trying to bring up positive stuff as much as possible. Okay, so I said this was a 2-part video. I hope you like my little metaphor that I came up with. The other part is when we're talking about different realities. And I've mentioned this on this channel multiple times. There are many, many manifesting teachers, many people on YouTube, on TikTok that talk about how you can jump from one reality to the next, right? And I've made videos on this too, where I talk about where I stand in terms of like multiple realities, right? And to me, it's always felt a lot like science fiction, and that it's hard to like imagine that you're jumping to another reality, right? The closest description to what I believe could be true, I saw on a TikTok, this one woman who was like a neuroscientist was talking about how there's like, I don't know, millions or billions of stimuli in every environment that we're in. So right now, I'm in this room and there's like books all over the place. There's, the window, the blinds are open. I can see the breeze going by through the leaves. I have this light over here. I have this, phone that I'm recording on. All this stuff that can get my attention, and that's just a few things in this room. There's so much around me, right? Then there's the sensation of how warm it is in this room. There's the sound of like the AC unit. There's all this stuff going on, and that's only like 10 things, right? And apparently there's just so much stimuli that we could absorb in this moment. And there's so much stuff that we're not even able to perceive because it's not something that like we could see with our eyes or feel, but it's there as well. And so the idea is that like our minds filter so much of the reality around us. It was some kind of crazy number. I wish I had written this shit down, but it was like, there's like 10 billion things you could perceive in a given instant, and you only perceive like 40,000 of them. And it's some kind of crazy number like that, where your perception is only a small sliver of everything around you. And I think that that's where this idea of multiple realities comes in, right? Because I don't think it's like, in Marvel movies or Star Trek or the Twilight Zone, where like somehow you like phase and you're in another reality, or like you cut a hole in reality and you walk into it. I think that's a very literal interpretation of it. I think instead, it's like around you is the possibility for any kind of reality that you could make, right? Around me right now is the possibility of all these horrible lives I could make for myself. I could have all these different addictions. I could cause problems for myself. The potential for it is right around me right now, right? And then there's also the possibility of all these wonderful realities where I could have like everything I wanted. And it literally is just my perception. Like in this moment, do I choose to do this, this, or this? And they're all little pathways from this very moment. And based on the way that I think and how I feel, those pathways are going to become more apparent to me. So if I'm thinking in a very negative way, and if I'm thinking the world is very hopeless and I'm needing some sort of instant gratification, then all of a sudden the pathways towards that instant gratification and future problems are going to present themselves to me. Those realities, right? And then if I'm thinking very positively of myself, if I have confidence in myself, and I'm thinking that there's all this potential in the world, then all of a sudden the steps I can take towards those possible awesome realities will present themselves, right? So I think that it's not a matter of, well, there's like 15 billion Peter Marshes and I could just switch out with one of them. I'm going to quantum leap into one of their bodies. I'm too skeptical to believe that. But I think that there's the potential for 50 billion Peter Marshes sitting right here on this couch. And it's just a matter of what am I going to perceive and what am I going to choose to believe? And then that's going to lead to me becoming a different version of myself, right? So just in summary, I think that there is only one reality. It's not like there's different dimensions that you can switch out. You can switch out with different versions of yourself. It's just that you're just potential that could be turned into anything. And what turns you into that thing is your belief about yourself, how you envision yourself, and the choices that you make, right? So thank you for watching. We're 14 minutes in. I have to say, if you're curious, I have actually manifested a few things within the past few months. I have seen the results. And it has worked when I've like taken action in the physical 3D tangible world. When you do that, combined with how you perceive yourself, real change happens. And just to kind of tie it all together, I really recommend you look up other manifestation videos and like just start following certain people and just listening to their different videos. Start looking up people online, reading their stuff. I think it's really worth it, because if you find yourself in that phase where you're like drowning, you're trying to reach the surface, like there is a real way for you to get to be floating on the surface and maybe even floating above, and then you can choose the ideal reality for yourself. All right. Thanks all so much. If you could, I would really love a like. I would absolutely love a new subscriber. But this is Pete, and I'll see you guys next time.